Good afternoon. My name is Howard Hanscom, Chair of the Board of Governors for the New York Compensation Insurance Rating Board. On behalf of the Board of Governors, I want to welcome each and every one of the 400 plus attendees joining us from your office or your remote work site. We thank you for spending your afternoon with us, and I am confident that you will both enjoy and benefit from today's presentations. I would like to thank my fellow board members, along with all the committee representatives, for your time, leadership, and expertise in support of the Rating Board and the workers' compensation market. As many of you know, the Rating Board has undergone a significant transformation over the course of the past 5 years, positioning the board to serve as an objective and trusted thought leader in this workers' compensation market. The Rating Board started with the fundamentals by improving its data collection and actuarial methodologies. The list of accomplishments is long. However, one I will share is the planned implementation of a new experience rating plan in 2022, designed to have an appropriate balance of accuracy, stability, equity, safety incentive, and simplicity. To help achieve these impressive results, the Rating Board is focused on the customer experience, embracing curiosity-driven research, encouraging themselves to learn the stories contained in the data, to embrace the outcomes, and to share those outcomes with its stakeholders. The collaboration of the Rating Board with other rating bureaus plays a significant role, providing opportunities for the Rating Board to share its knowledge, to learn from others, and to collaborate on projects. The countrywide mega claim study being one example. And today, the Rating Board is using its data to make the marketplace even more transparent for everyone with its annual workers' compensation forum. As you know, as stakeholders in this industry, we rely on the Rating Board for data as well as insight into current and emerging trends. The COVID pandemic being one which brought a lot of change and uncertainty, and we relied on the Rating Board to assist the industry in managing through this challenging environment. In many ways, the Rating Board's mission and vision couldn't be more important, as providing the marketplace with accurate and timely data will help all stakeholders navigate the best path forward. So I want to say thank you to the President of the Rating Board, along with the entire staff of the New York Compensation Insurance Rating Board, for your efforts, your successes, and your accomplishments. At this time, it is my honor to introduce the President and Chief Executive Officer of the New York Compensation Insurance Rating Board, Mr. Jeremy Addy.
Welcome. My name is Jeremy Addy, and I'm the President of the Rating Board. Thank you for joining us at our 2021 forum. This is the second year that we're gathering together virtually, but we gather with the hope that next year we'll be able to see each other again in person. In the meantime, we thank you for inviting us into your homes and offices and making time for us today. Now, those of you who've joined us at previous forums may remember that I've shared stories about my daughter Mira, along with the ways that she's helped me see things that aren't always so easy for me to see. With remote work and business travel curtailed, we've spent a lot of time together. And like most 5-year-olds, she asks a lot of questions. Why do I have to go to kindergarten? Why did you put carrots on my plate? Why is the Rating Board changing its experience rating program? Now, I do the best I can to answer her questions. And sometimes in those moments, she's really listening. I can see the wheels turning in her head. At other times, she's really just waiting for me to finish speaking so that she can respond. The truth is that deep listening and engaging is hard. It takes intention and practice. And that's true for a 5-year-old, and it's also true for us. And at the Rating Board, it has never been more important to make that effort and engage our stakeholders. All of them, from carriers, brokers, agents, and employers to claimants, attorneys, regulators, and policymakers. We must listen intently and incorporate what we hear into our work in a meaningful way. Sure, it's easier to put our head in the sand, but doing so implies that we're doing everything right and have nothing to learn. So when a stakeholder complains about our manual, we respond by trying to understand what people are experiencing and asking how we can resolve it. Now, in some cases, we can't, because our mandate is to maintain a system that promotes fairness to the whole. But we listen and remain open to changing our minds and questioning assumptions, because it's the only way that we can realize our vision of serving as the objective thought leader in the marketplace. Now, this takes focus and discipline in ordinary times, and even more so today. Adam Grant, an organizational psychologist at Wharton, wrote about this in his most recent book, Think Again. He argues that we live in a time when people hold on to their views stridently, and changing positions or making mistakes can be interpreted as a weakness or a threat to competence. He reasons that for some, it's appealing to think like a prosecutor, prove your case, because it gives us the comfort of convictions and protects us against the discomfort of doubt. But at the Rating Board, we know that if we don't listen with intention, if we aren't willing to question our long-held beliefs and methods, we will stand still while the world changes around us, and we will fall short. So we reward innovation and the behaviors that promote it. We treat an opinion as a hypothesis to be tested. We think about why we might be wrong instead of focusing on proving that we're right. We listen to ideas that make us think, not just make us feel good. And we seek feedback from people who challenge our thought process, not just those who agree with our conclusions. And with this mindset, we position ourselves to best serve you, our stakeholders, and find innovative solutions to today's problems. And I believe that we are on our way to doing just that. In 2021, we completed a multi-year effort to evaluate and revise New York's Experience Rating Program, a program that goes to the core of our mandate, promoting accurate pricing while incentivizing safety. We began this research effort in 2017 with our eyes open, not knowing what we would find, let alone how long it would take us to find it. We committed to following the data wherever it led, even if that meant changing a program that had been in place for decades. Our review exposed several issues in the existing program, and you'll hear about some of those later today. We investigated and tested alternative methodologies, we worked with our actuarial committee, and we consulted with many of you to develop a program that achieves an appropriate balance between accuracy, stability, and equity, while also incentivizing safety. And I'm proud to tell you that our new experience rating methodology will do just that, and has been approved for use by the New York State Department of Financial Services on ratings effective on and after October 1st, 2022. We recognize that while the experience rating program redesign will bring value to stakeholders, change can be difficult, especially when it impacts pricing for all employers. To facilitate a smooth transition, we are committed to providing educational materials in multiple mediums, from pamphlets and interactive worksheets to animated videos and stakeholder webinars. And to keep you ahead of the curve, we'll release a mod estimator application in the spring of 2022 to provide insight into upcoming experience modification factors. Moving on to data collection, our focus on obtaining clean data to gain insights into the marketplace has never been more important. And recent improvements to our data collection efforts could not be more timely. Submissions in response to the Rating Board's indemnity data call are flowing in and provide us with a new view of the marketplace. At the same time, we're making the final preparations to launch an enhanced data quality program that will result in cleaner data, putting us in a better position to serve you. And all the while, our growing actuarial team has continued to publish reports and studies bringing transparency to the state's workers' compensation system. The 2021 State of the System report provides the latest marketplace insights and trends, while our 2021 Pandemic Impact Study drills down into some of the most important issues in our industry. These publications add to our growing body of work, available to all those who want a deeper understanding of the workers' compensation system in New York. While publishing research studies and reports are a priority, our rate-making methodology and annual loss cost filing remains a primary focus. And some context here is important. In the spring of 2019, following a string of double-digit loss cost changes, our Board of Governors asked us to research more stable rate-making methods. We did. And in February of 2020, prior to the pandemic, our actuarial committee, together with our regulators, approved our transition to a more stable rate-making methodology. We applied this new methodology in the spring of 2020, did so again in the spring of 2021, and we are committed to continue doing so for at least a full insurance cycle, dampening both increases and decreases to bring more pricing stability to New York's employers. And I'm happy to report to you that in July of 2021, the New York State Department of Financial Services approved the Rating Board's actuarially recommended loss cost level change. The overall loss cost level in New York State will decrease by 6.4% on October 1st, 2021. Now, we are seeing significant changes in the marketplace. Changes to how we work, where we work, and how we interact with each other. And slowly, these changes are finding their way into our data. So as you will shortly see, our data sets are beginning to reflect the change that we've all been feeling. But first, some high-level numbers. Premium levels decreased by 15.5% in 2020, with 190 individual insurers writing premiums in excess of $1 million. 2020 pricing was competitive. The New York State Insurance Fund market share dipped to 33.9%, and there was a wide range of approved loss cost multipliers in the state, which translated to competitive pricing for New York State's employers. The calendar year 2020 combined ratio is 90.8%, which is 9 points higher than the 2019 combined ratio. And that's just the beginning of what we have to report to you today. We're excited to share our work and the latest marketplace data. We'll begin with the 2021 state of the system and follow that with a presentation on the state's economy. We will then review the pandemic's impact on the state's workers' compensation system, and we'll close the forum by asking our research team to discuss what lies ahead for experience rating in New York. So without further ado, I'm happy to introduce the Rating Board's Chief Actuary, Zeev Kimmel. Zeev will present the 2021 state of the system. Take it away, Zeev.
Thank you, Jeremy. Welcome to the 2021 State of the System presentation. While we hope that the worst of the pandemic is behind us, in terms of the data and the effect of the pandemic on workers' compensation, there's still a long way to go. We certainly know a lot more this year than we did a year ago, but we still don't know everything. Data is slow to emerge and it changes over time. For this presentation, depending on the data source, some of the information I'm going to share with you is from before the pandemic, which serves as a benchmark for the changes that emerged. Other information is from the pandemic era, specifically when examining what happened during calendar year 2020. It will still be some time before we can gauge what the workers' compensation system will look like in the post-pandemic environment. So let's get to it, and we'll start with some key figures. I'd like to focus your attention on two key figures. First, the negative 6.4% loss cost level indication displayed on the upper left side of the slide. There were a lot of questions we had to address as we approach this year's filing, and I'll discuss those a little later. But again, the bottom line is a negative 6.4 overall loss cost level change. Second, the calendar year 2020 combined ratio of 90.8%, displayed on the bottom right side. This represents an increase from the combined ratios we saw in the previous 2 years, but over the long term, this is still a very low result. Again, I'll discuss what this means as well as the details behind the combined ratio later on. So here's the agenda for the presentation. As I mentioned, I will go into some of the details of the loss cost filing, explain the methodology we use, and address some of the questions we faced during this changing environment. I'll provide some statistics related to COVID-19 and its impact on the workers' compensation system. Later today, we will have a presentation that will include more detailed information on the pandemic. I will then proceed to discuss some premium and market share statistics. We'll then move on to loss statistics, and I'll conclude by bringing the premium and losses information together for a discussion on underwriting results, which will of course include the details on the combined ratio. We'll start with the loss cost filing. As was mentioned earlier, in July, the New York State Department of Financial Services approved the Rating Board's actuarially recommended 6.4% average loss cost decrease, ensuring that loss costs in New York remain at adequate levels. Here we have a historical perspective of loss cost and rate level changes. The blue bars represent rate changes, and in October of 2008, we moved to a loss cost system represented by the purple bars. Interestingly, over the past 20 years, the cumulative change represented by the yellow line is a decrease of 10.7%. This means that on average, workers' compensation premium rates are 10.7% lower than they were in 2002. You can see that the 2021 approval is the fifth consecutive decrease, following the 4.5% decrease in 2017, the two consecutive double-digit decreases in 2018 and 2019, and the 1% decrease in 2020. This is very evident when you look at the yellow line towards the right side of the slide. So let's discuss the loss cost filing process. But first, I'd like to address the elephant in the room, which is of course the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the loss cost filing. Going into this year's filing, we had to deal with the fact that 2020 was not a typical year, and as a result, the latest year of data, policy year 2019, would be different. We had to address a number of questions: how to handle COVID claims, how to treat the changing economic conditions, including the exceptional average wage increase in calendar year 2020. Last year, as part of the 2020 loss cost filing, we implemented an actuarial methodology which, by design, is intended to prevent us from overreacting to sudden changes in the system, which may be temporary in nature. In addition, we found that, as unusual as this year may have been, many of the changes offset one another. This offsetting effect, together with the approved methodology, which is designed to promote stability, resulted in a 6.4% decrease in the overall loss cost level. So let's start by looking at COVID data. This data is for accident year 2020, which means that these claims and losses are for accidents that occurred in 2020, regardless of whether the underlying policy was written in 2019 or 2020. The data is valid as of December 31st, 2020, which means that the values reported are as they are known as of year-end 2020 and do not reflect information that comes to light in 2021. One more thing to note. The data represents only the private insurance marketplace. It does not include self-insured entities, including the state government and many municipalities. First, the total number of COVID-19 indemnity claims reported in accident year 2020 is 3,213. Only lost time claims are included in this figure. It is important to note that accidents that happened near year-end, November or December, may not have been filed by December 31st, 2020, and if not, they will not be reflected in this data. Second, the total amount paid for COVID-19 claims in accident year 2020 is $8.5 million. The total case incurred on non-accident year 2020 claims is $61 million. This amount includes both the amounts paid and the amounts reserved on each claim. The amounts shown include data on both indemnity and medical-only claims. We will see the breakdown between indemnity and medical losses on the next slide. However, we also know that losses generally develop beyond what was anticipated when claim reserves were first set, and that added development is accounted for in aggregate rate making by applying development factors, which are derived during rate making by examining historical experience in the aggregate. Development factors are applied to reported losses to estimate ultimate losses. The reason for applying development factors is that when case reserves are initially set, limited information is available. We know from experience that as time passes, reserves on a claim are updated to reflect the medical condition of the claimant until the claim is closed. The application of development factors reflects those adjustments. Development factors have not been applied to the $8.5 and $61.4 million figures. Rather, this data is as reported. However, if these claims behave like other workers' compensation claims, and there's reason to believe that they will not, we would expect that the case incurred for accident year 2020 will increase over time. When we apply the statewide loss development factors, the potential range of ultimate COVID-19 losses for accident year 2020 will be between $90 and $180 million. This does not include any 2021 claims. Again, COVID claims could behave and develop very differently than the average workers' compensation claim, which is typically a traumatic musculoskeletal injury. But we still wanted to describe these amounts as it may help us understand what the ultimate COVID-19 loss amount may be. Next, we're going to look at how these losses break down by year and by category. I'm going to walk through the data broken down and organized by policy year. We organize the data by policy year because that is how the data is utilized in rate making. Policy year refers to the year in which a policy became effective. For example, let's consider a policy that began on December 31st, 2019 and expired on December 31st, 2020. Even though the vast majority of this policy covers events that happened in 2020, all of the data related to this policy is counted within policy year 2019 because the policy was written in 2019. Accordingly, COVID-19 losses will be in the experience of policy year 2019 and policy year 2020, which is not yet complete. The Rating Board's rate-making methodology requires that we utilize data from policy years 2018 and 2019 for the 2021 filing. Remember, policy year 2020 is not yet complete because many policies written in 2020 have not yet expired. Data from policy year 2020 will not be complete and available for use until the 2022 filing. The table on top contains policy year 2019 and 2020 COVID claims data, valued as of December 31st, 2020. The bottom table contains the ratios of COVID-19 data to data from all claims, both COVID and non-COVID. The first breakdown I'll discuss is by year. As I mentioned, the first row represents information from policy year 2019, and the second row refers to policy year 2020. The total indemnity claim counts for each year are split into open versus closed. And you can see there were a total of 823 claims in policy year 2019, representing 2% of the total for that year. Remember, the data for policy year 2020 is incomplete and was not used in the 2021 loss cost filing. For loss amounts, we have the reported undeveloped paid amounts and the undeveloped total case incurred amounts separately for indemnity and medical. Again, all of this data is valued as of December 31st, 2020. As I noted in the previous slide, the paid and incurred amounts in this slide are as reported and have not yet been developed. For policy year 2019, undeveloped incurred COVID-19 loss amounts are $23.4 million, and they represent 1% of the total reported losses in the state. So what do we do with COVID-19 losses from policy year 2019? Do we let them flow through the experience, or do we exclude them and put in place a pandemic load to account for this risk? We decided to simply include COVID-19 losses in rate making and forego the adoption of a pandemic load at present. First, because the approved rate-making methodology adopted by the Rating Board in February of 2020 smooths outliers over time and protects against overreaction to temporary system changes. In fact, with this method, the experience of policy year 2019 carries limited weight in the experience component of the indication. And second, because establishing a pandemic load to account for future pandemics would be better done once we have the benefit of all the data from this pandemic. The current pandemic is not over yet. We're still very much in it. We do not yet have all of the data resulting from it, and we have a lot to learn from it. For example, some pandemic impacts may offset each other. First, the appearance of COVID claims may be offset by the decrease in non-COVID claims due to economic changes. Second, the decrease in frequency may be offset by an increase in severity due to the changes in the mix of the claims that are filed. With that in mind, let's talk about the steps we take to derive the overall indication. There are several components to the loss cost filing. First, experience. In this component, we look at the latest 2 policy years of available data and measure how losses compare to premium. In the trend section, we want to see how these measures, namely premiums and losses, are projected to change over time from the experience period to the prospective filing period. To that, we add benefit level changes, which primarily result from changes in the maximum weekly benefits and the projected change in loss adjustment expenses. Finally, we examine the catastrophe provisions. Any change in the terrorism loss cost provision or in the provision for natural catastrophes will potentially affect the overall loss cost level change in the state. We're going to take a deeper look into the experience and trend components. Let's start with experience. For the experience section, we examine how premiums and losses compare. The latest 2 policy years for which we have complete data are 2018 and 2019, and all of the data is valued as of December 31st, 2020. The blue bars represent the premium amounts for the 2 policy years. The reported amounts are at loss cost levels, so they do not include the effect of loss cost multipliers. They are also adjusted to the level of the current loss costs, because really what we're trying to measure is the adequacy of the current loss cost level. The red bars represent total reported loss amounts for the 2 policy years. These loss amounts are also valued as of December 31st, 2020. For each of these years, we're looking at both incurred loss amounts, which include payments and case reserves, and we also do a separate analysis looking at paid losses only. We know, however, as I mentioned earlier in the context of COVID claims, that regardless of whether we look at paid or incurred loss amounts, the value of claims changes over time as they develop until they reach ultimate value. So we have to adjust the reported losses to estimate what their ultimate value would be. We do that by applying a development factor. These lines represent how 1st to 19th incurred loss development factors have changed over time, with the blue line showing indemnity development factors and the yellow line showing medical development factors. What does that mean? How does the loss development factor work? As an example, a 1st to 19th development factor of 2.528 means that if a group of claims generated $1 billion of losses at first report, after 19 years, the value of the claims are estimated to become $2.528 billion. The incurred loss development factors remained relatively stable from 2008 until 2013, and then experienced a decrease. In fact, the latest calendar year development factor is the lowest we've seen. To promote stability, the rating board has been using development factors based on the most recent 5 years. In this year's filing, we're using loss development factors from 2016 to 2020, and we're going to apply the resulting averages to the reported losses to get ultimate losses. Here, we're also looking at indemnity and medical development factors, but these are paid loss development factors, which are to be applied to reported paid losses to get the estimate of ultimate losses. We see a similar pattern with the paid loss development factors, as they have also exhibited a decrease over the past several years. Once again, to promote stability, we're using the 5-year averages, which are the loss development factors from 2016 to 2020. And we're going to apply the resulting averages to the reported paid losses to get the estimate of ultimate losses. So we started with premiums and reported losses. Now let's apply these 5-year average development factors to incurred loss amounts and paid loss amounts to get the preliminary estimate of ultimate losses for both policy years 2018 and 2019. Now let's talk about our approved rate-making procedure. And we'll start again by discussing the blue columns. I mentioned that the blue column represents premiums, but in effect, this blue column, because it represents premium at loss cost level, excluding all expenses, loss cost multipliers, etc., another way to think about it is that it really represents ultimate losses that are underlying the current loss costs. So keep that in mind. It is another estimate of ultimate losses because this is what we targeted last year as the total amount that would be needed to pay for losses during the current period. So I have one estimate of ultimate losses in the red and yellow column, but remember, I also have another estimate of ultimate losses represented by the blue column. So my new estimate of ultimate losses will be a combination of these two estimates. I'm going to take a weighted average of the red and yellow estimate and the blue estimate to get a new combined estimate represented by the green bar. That's what this method does. It's a weighted average of two different loss estimates. So this procedure acts to effectively stabilize the indication. The new experience indication for each policy year is the difference between the green bar and the blue bar. So we start with the incurred loss indication for 2018. Following this procedure, the experience indication is the difference between the blue column, representing premiums, and the green column, representing our estimated ultimate losses. And in this case, a decrease of 2.7%. We then performed the same analysis, but this time we just utilized the paid loss information. We take a weighted average of the two loss estimates to derive the green loss estimate, and now the indication based on paid losses is an increase of 0.8%. So the average indication for policy year 2018 is the average of the paid indication and the incurred indication, or -1%. We do the exact same thing for policy year 2019. After employing our procedure, the incurred loss indication for 2019 is -4.6%, and the paid loss indication for 2019 is -0.4%, for an average of -2.5%. So our experience indication for 2018 is -1%, the experience indication for 2019 is -2.5%, and the average experience indication for the two policy years is -1.7%. So we're going to go ahead and plug that in for the experience component. Let's talk about trend. For the 2021 filing, which has an effective date of October 1st, 2021, we used experience information for policy years 2018 and 2019. We have to remember, though, we are not trying to determine what the loss costs should have been back in 2018 and 2019. We are trying to determine the appropriate loss cost level for the future for policies that will be written starting in October of 2021, but also for policies that will be written in September of 2022, which will remain in effect until September of 2023. So we know our starting point is -1.7%, but we need to determine how the measures of premiums and losses are projected to change from the experience period until the prospective filing period, which is what we refer to as trend. So let's see what this looks like in terms of the timeline. So we start with the definition of policy year 2018. The first policy is effective January 1st, 2018 and expires January 1st, 2019. The last policy of this policy year becomes effective December 31st, 2018 and expires December 31st, 2019. So policy year 2018 really spans a 2 calendar year period. Similarly, this is policy year 2019. So when we talk about the experience period of 2 policy years, we're really talking about this period. The filing, as I mentioned, has an effective date of October 1st, 2021. And the last policy for which we're making loss costs will expire on September 30th, 2023. The midpoint of the experience period is July 1st, 2019, and the midpoint of the prospective filing period is October 1st, 2022. So when I say I want to project how premiums and losses will change from the experience period to the prospective filing period, this is the trend period I'm talking about. From the midpoint of the experience period to the midpoint of the prospective filing period. Note that we're talking about 3¼ years. Trend is divided into several components: claim frequency, claim severity, which we'll examine separately for indemnity and medical, and wage information. Let's start with wages, because they affect the various components of the overall trend factors in several ways, which I'll get to in a minute. So let's take a look at the wage line. The red line represents the average weekly wage in New York over the past several years. Through 2019, wages are increasing relatively consistently at about 3% per year. In 2020, however, we observe a 10% increase in the average wages over the previous year. Some of the significant increase is attributable to a change in industry mix, with 2020 seeing increased employment in high-paying industries such as information technology and healthcare, and employment losses in lower-wage industries such as hospitality and entertainment. And even within some industries, job losses affected mostly low-wage earners, so that those who remained in the job market earned higher wages on average. We then need to project wages all the way to the prospective filing period. Our source for this projection is the New York State Assembly's economic report, and these future projections are actually lower than the historical wage changes. We're looking at a projection of 1.2% in 2021 and 1% in 2022. Combining these projections with the actual increases from 2019 and 2020, over the trend period, or 3¼ years, average wages are projected to increase by over 12%. So how does the overall wage trend serve as an offset to the trend factor? First, we have to appreciate that when we hold employment and loss costs constant, higher wages generate additional premium. Now, if losses are increasing at the same pace as premium, then no further loss cost adjustment is needed. If losses are increasing faster than premium, then we would need to adjust loss costs higher. And if losses are increasing slower, a downward adjustment is warranted. The blue line represents the total loss ratio trend. This is really a combination of the frequency, indemnity severity, and medical severity, which I'll discuss shortly. As you can see, it has experienced a decrease in 2016, but has increased since then. We are using the changes of the most recent 5 years to determine what the future projection line is. So because the blue line is increasing over the past few years, and after applying the loss trend methodology, as we're going to discuss shortly, my projection line is also increasing, but at a lower rate than wages. So the loss ratio line projection is increasing at a slower pace than wages and premiums, and certainly not increasing at a pace close to the increases in wages. This creates a gap at the midpoint of the prospective filing period and results in a trend factor of negative 6.3%. Let's take a closer look at the different components of the loss trend factor: indemnity severity, medical severity, and claim frequency. We'll start with indemnity severity. We start with the blue line, representing actual indemnity average cost per case over the past 5 policy years. The black line represents the valuation date of the reported data. It's the latest point of known data. So through the latest point of known data, indemnity severity is increasing at this projected rate, about 5.9% per year. However, from this point forward, we are not using the same growth rate. Instead, we're using a growth rate of a selected index. For indemnity severity, the most appropriate index is wages, because again, indemnity benefits are a function of wages. So here the red line represents the historical wages, with projected increases in 2021 and 2022 represented by the purple line. To project indemnity severity from the latest point of known data to the midpoint of the prospective filing period, we're using the projected rate of increases in wages. Let's examine medical severity. Similarly, the blue line represents medical severity per lost time claim over the most recent 5 policy years. Although we observe some volatility, overall we observe a slightly increasing pattern at 0.4% per year. So we project that from the experience period to the latest point of known data, there will be a small increase. For medical severity, we use a similar approach, but we utilize a different index called the Chain-Weighted Personal Healthcare Index. This index has been steadily increasing at a very consistent rate, and the projection is that it will continue to do so. Using our index methodology, we project that from the latest point of known data to the midpoint of the prospective filing period, medical severity will move at the same rate as the index. Frequency is measured as the number of lost time claims per $1 million of premiums at loss cost level, with the premiums adjusted to a common wage base. Claim frequency has been decreasing for the past several years. We'll see shortly that calendar year 2020 had a significant decrease in the number of claims. However, when measured against the premium level, the decrease in claim frequency for policy year 2019 has not been as significant as the raw decrease in claim activity. 2019 claim frequency decreased by 3.8%, and over the past 5 years, the claim frequency has declined at a rate of negative 1.9% per year, despite the large decrease in the latest year. For claim frequency, our standard methodology does not utilize any index, so we project that frequency will continue to decrease at the same rate. So to summarize, wages are increasing and are projected to continue to increase. The loss ratio trend is projected to increase as well, but at a slower pace. The different growth rate for wages and for the loss ratios results in a 6.3% gap at the midpoint of the prospective filing period. So this is the trend factor we put in the filing. So we started with experience at negative 1.7%. This is the trend section. We add on plus 2% to account for the annual increase in maximum weekly benefits, which again is influenced by the 10% increase in the 2020 average weekly wage. We also add a small change of plus 0.6% in the loss adjustment expense provision. For catastrophes, the 2021 filing included a reduction in both the terrorism loss cost provision as well as the natural disasters and catastrophic industrial accidents provision. These reductions contributed a decrease of 1.1% to the overall indication. Putting all the components together, we get negative 6.4%. I discussed the impact of the pandemic on the loss cost filing. We do have some additional statistics on claim filing activity in the state that would give us a clue as far as where the impact of the pandemic on the system is going. First, let's take a look at the percentage difference in claims activity between 2019 and 2020. We see that in January and February, claim activity was relatively similar, with a decrease of about 5% in February. In March, the pandemic really hit New York. In mid-March, the governor issued a stay-at-home order, putting New York on pause. This resulted in a significant decrease in claim activity, with March down by 24%. But this was just when New York was on pause for half of the month. April and May were full months with New York on pause. With the New York economy starting to reopen in June and July, the effect on claim activity is clear. For the remainder of 2020, claims remained between 18% and 28% lower than 2019 levels. In total, claim activity in 2020 was down about 24%. Let's take a look at the first few months of 2021. First, let's continue with the year-over-year changes, comparing 2021 claim activity to 2020 claim activity. We see that while in January and February the claim activity was down, in March of 2021 there were about 17% more claims than in March of 2020, with much higher increases in April and May of 2021 when compared to 2020. However, when we compare the 2021 claim activity levels to the pre-pandemic levels of 2019, we see that we are still below those pre-pandemic levels. Later today, we will have a presentation of the Rating Board's latest research providing various insights into COVID claims and the impact of the pandemic on the workers' compensation system. With that in mind, let's discuss other statistics on premiums and losses in New York. Premium volume in the state decreased from $5.6 billion in 2019 to $4.7 billion in 2020. This is a significant decrease of over 15%. Premiums are a function of exposure, as measured by payroll, and price, and the starting point for the price is the loss costs. From 2010 until 2016, growth in payroll as well as increasing loss costs resulted in significant premium growth, which was followed by stable premiums through 2018. In 2019, we saw a decrease of about 5%, which was mostly attributable to the recent decreases in the loss cost level. In 2020, the significant decrease is due to both the reduction in economic activity and the resulting lower workers' compensation exposure, as well as the recent significant decreases in the loss cost level. But we have to remember that there are other factors affecting premium volume in the state, such as deductible credits, which could be very significant. Let's talk about classifications. Data is collected by each occupational classification. There are over 550 different occupational classifications in the system. The data by classification is reported on the unit statistical reports and includes audited payroll amounts and premium amounts. But because of the reporting lag of this data, the latest full policy year available is policy year 2018. While we expect this data to change in the future, it's important to understand what happened right before the pandemic hit as a benchmark to compare with the post-pandemic environment. This is a view of the top 10 governing classes in New York in terms of payroll. The clerical office employees class represents the largest class in terms of payroll. It is followed by hospitals, physicians, building operations, and schools. While we don't have complete audited payroll information for policy year 2019, preliminary information suggests a significant reduction in the restaurant class code, which may actually be knocked out of the top 10 classes when we report on this statistic next year. It will be interesting to see the future changes in the top 10 classes. The top 10 classes by payroll represent 53% of the total statewide payroll, but only 17% of the standard premium. This is because some classes, such as the clerical office employees class, have very low loss costs and generate very little premium. In fact, when we rank the classes in terms of premiums, this clerical office employees code doesn't even make it to the top 10. Hospitals generate more premiums than any other class. Interestingly, in the top 10, we have 3 classes in terms of premium volume that are from healthcare-related industries. This points to the importance of the healthcare sector in workers' compensation and to the economy in general. Restaurants are the 4th largest class in terms of premium. Again, we expect this ranking to change next year. Moving on to market share information. The New York State Insurance Fund is a competitive state fund and is not there strictly to serve the residual market, as may be the case in some other jurisdictions. The market share is often viewed as a measure of how competitive the market is. Market shares can be measured in different ways. First, there is the direct written premiums, which are reported on the carrier's annual financial statements. These are the premiums after the application of premium discounts, deductible credits, and so on. Based on this measure, in calendar year 2020, the state fund's market share is 33.9% and private carriers are 66.1%. Next, we keep the premium definition as is, but we split the private carriers into two pieces. One piece in pink is regular policies, and the other in purple represents large deductible policies. So all we did here was keep the state fund market share the same, but we split the 66.1% of the private carriers into 55.5% written on regular policies and 10.6% written on large deductible policies. Next, we look at the market share based on standard premiums. Standard premiums, as defined here, represent premium before the application of premium discounts and deductible credits, which could be very significant. In other words, focusing on the 10.6% that were written on large deductible policies, if they were written on a standard basis without those credits, the premiums would have been much higher and would actually represent over 41% of the premiums in the state. So on a standard premium basis, this brings the state fund's market share to 24.4%. Finally, we have to remember that so far we're talking about the insured market. According to the National Academy of Social Insurance, workers' compensation benefits paid for self-insured claims represents about a third of the entire marketplace. Bringing this into the mix yields a state fund market share of just over 16% out of the entire workers' compensation marketplace. We briefly go back to the direct written premium market shares, and here we observe how the market share has changed over time. We know that after gradually increasing market share up to a high of 45.1% in 2014, we are observing 6 straight years of decreasing market shares down to a level of 33.9% in 2020, which is the lowest we have seen in quite some time. After the rating board derives the loss costs, carriers then apply their loss cost multipliers, or LCMs, to get their full rates. Here we see that 93 carriers have a loss cost multiplier between 1.3 and 1.4, more than in any other loss cost multiplier range. However, most premium is written with a loss cost multiplier of under 1.2. Here we show the premium written by loss cost multiplier range both on a direct basis in blue and standard basis in yellow. The differences between the bars are primarily attributable to deductible credits, followed by premium discounts and other more minor credits and charges. We observe then that not only most premiums are written with a loss cost multiplier of less than 1.2, but we also see that most deductible credits are applied on lower loss cost multiplier policies. Now let's examine the distribution of policies by policy size. Most policies in the state, over 400,000, are relatively small policies with premium under $5,000. Despite the large number of these policies, representing more than 75% of all policies in the state, because of their small size, they only generate less than 6% of the total premium in the state. Larger policies represent a small portion of policies, but a significant portion of premiums. Policies with premium over $50,000 represent less than 5% of policies, but account for almost 75% of premium. Policies with premium over $1 million are 0.2% of policies, but more than 30% of premium. Let's shift gears and discuss some loss statistics. We start with claim closure rates. Overall, at first report, which is 18 months from the policy effective date, about 70% of claims are closed. At 10th report, or 9 years later, about 97% of claims are closed. But we have very different pictures when we examine the more minor medical-only claims against lost time claims. Close to 90% of medical-only claims are closed at first report, and almost all of them are closed at 10th report. Lost time claims, on the other hand, remain open much longer, with only 38% closed at first report. At 10th report, about 8% of lost time claims are still open. Looking at the lost payment pattern, we see that after 10 years, only 73.3% of lost payments have been made. This means that there are still more than 26% of lost payments remaining to be made on only 8% of the lost time claims. This implies that these claims that remain open after 10 years are the most severe claims and will be paid out over many more years. Examining the distribution of claims and losses by injury type, we observe that although medical-only claims account for almost 60% of claims, they are generally small claims and represent only 2% of the total loss amounts. Fatal and permanent total claims don't happen often, but they still represent more than 5% of losses. Permanent partial claims are the most significant cost driver, accounting for almost 75% of losses, even though they represent less than 20% of the claims. These are the top 10 injured parts of body in terms of claim counts on the left and in terms of reported loss amounts on the right. It's interesting to note that injuries of certain parts of body are clearly more expensive than others. For example, shoulder injuries represent 9% of claim counts, but close to 14% of lost dollars. On the other hand, fingers and thumbs represent more than 12% of injuries and 3% of losses. Injuries to the lower back, knee, and shoulder, as well as claims involving multiple body parts, represent the highest percentage of losses. Later today, we will hear about how some of the claim distributions look differently when examining COVID claims. Next, we're going to look at the distribution of medical costs, and the numbers over the next several slides are going to be from our medical data call, representing payments made for services performed in 2020. Despite being a non-typical year, overall, medical distributions in 2020 were relatively stable. Later today, the presentation on the pandemic's impact on the system will shed some light on some areas of notable differences. But for now, we'll start with the overall distribution of 2020 medical payments into major medical cost categories. And we observe that physicians represented the largest medical payment category, with about half the medical payments in 2020, followed by hospitals with 21.4% and prescription drugs at under 10%. Digging a little deeper into the largest category of physician costs, we see that in 2020, payments for surgical procedures represent just over a quarter of physician payments, followed by physical medicine, which represents an additional 24% of physician costs, and evaluation and management services at 19.5%. The evaluation and management percentage represent a small increase from what we saw in 2019. The second highest payment category was hospital services. So we would like to examine the breakdown of facility services. Payment for inpatient hospital services were approximately 45% of all facility services, a small decrease from 2019. Ambulatory surgical centers were about 26% of facility services payments, and outpatient payments were just under 24%. This is the first year we're seeing payments for ambulatory surgical centers exceeding payments for outpatient hospital services. Let's take a closer look at prescription drugs. An examination of drug payments as a percentage of total medical payments shows an increase from 2012 through 2014. At that point, the combination of a nationwide battle against the opioid epidemic, which included the I-STOP legislation in New York, as well as stronger adherence to medical treatment guidelines, may have contributed to the significant decrease in payments for prescription drugs through 2019, and an additional decrease, albeit smaller, in 2020. Taking a closer look at various prescription drug categories, we see that opioids, on top, are still the biggest contributor to drug costs. Several years ago, however, opioids represented 29.1% of drug costs. So the opioid share of total prescription drug spend decreased significantly to just under 22% in 2020. This decrease in the opioid category is clearly a contributor to the overall decrease in the share of prescription drug spend out of total medical spend. After talking about premiums and losses, where does it all bring us in terms of underwriting results? We're going to start with accident year loss ratios, which are ratios of losses on claims occurring in each year to premiums from those years. And these are the loss ratios by accident year. And they have declined from a high of 86% in 2011 to about 51% in accident year 2016. At that point, we hit an inflection point. As loss costs started decreasing in 2017 and 2018, the resulting loss ratios increased to a level of 57.6% in accident year 2019. So it looks like a reversal of the cycle, and under normal circumstances, it would be reasonable to expect that this increasing loss ratio trend would continue. But then the pandemic hit. So in 2020, we have a bit of a break in the cycle with a decrease in the loss ratio from 57.6% to 54.3%. This happens because on an accident year basis, the reduction in claims more than offset the reduction in premium. A combined ratio is the ratio of losses, expenses, and dividends to premium. To get the combined ratios, we start with the loss ratios, and we add the expense ratios and the dividend ratios. Generally speaking, as an example, an accident year combined ratio of 90% means that for every dollar of premium earned by a carrier in a particular year, they will pay 90 cents in losses occurring during that year and expenses incurred during that year. The combined ratio measure does not take investment income into account. Accident year combined ratios over the past 10 years have declined from a high of over 132% in 2011 down to the low 90s in the middle of the decade and as low as 87.5% in 2017, a significant decrease. With expense ratios remaining relatively stable, the latest year is exhibiting the same pattern as we saw for the loss ratios, with increases in 2018 and 2019 and a decrease in 2020 to a combined ratio of 90.3. Now, a few words before we turn to calendar year results. First, we have to remember the difference between accident year results and calendar year results. While accident year results relate to financial outcomes associated with claims occurring in the respective year, calendar year results relate to financial outcomes associated with transactions occurring in a given year. For example, if a payment is made in 2020 on a claim that occurred in 2014, that payment is part of accident year 2014 results and calendar year 2020 results. This doesn't apply just to payments, but also to reserve changes. For example, if reserves are lowered during 2020 on a claim from 2014, that results in a lower loss ratio for accident year 2014, but for calendar year 2020. Recall how I explained earlier, in the context of the loss cost filing, that loss development factors have been decreasing significantly over the past several years. This is attributed to carriers lowering reserves, and lowering of reserves during a particular calendar year drives down that calendar year's loss ratios. And when we look at the resulting calendar year loss ratios, we see several years of decreasing calendar year loss ratios, from a high of 85% in 2012 to the low of 46.9% in 2019. This decrease was driven in part by a combination of increasing loss cost levels and lower claim frequency. But specifically in recent years, lowering of reserves resulted in significant decreases in the calendar year loss ratios. Before I show you the 2020 calendar year loss ratio, I want to remind you again about how different forces in the system may have offsetting impacts on results. On one hand, we have fewer claims in the system in 2020. Lower loss development factors that we saw earlier, resulting from reduced reserves on claims from older years, also contributed to lower loss amounts for the specific calendar year. However, in 2020, these reserve reductions were not as significant as in 2019 and 2018, leading to an increase in the calendar year loss ratio to a level of 54.8%. This loss ratio, 54.8, is still relatively low when compared to the results we saw earlier in the decade, but not as low as in the previous 2 years. To determine the combined ratio, we again start with the loss ratios in blue, and we add on the expense ratios and the dividend ratios. The resulting 2020 combined ratio is 90.8%. Again, this is considered low from a historical perspective, but significantly higher than what we saw in recent years. We have to remember, though, that this is just a snapshot of financial results based on transactions occurring during the specific calendar year, which may include payments and reserve changes on claims that occurred years ago. It is not a measure of whether premiums were too high or too low, because the premiums and losses used in the calculation do not come from the same group of policies. It is also important to remember that it is a snapshot of transactions occurring during a single year, but should not be relied on to measure long-term profitability, especially in workers' compensation, which is a very long tail line. A better measure, but still not a perfect measure of longer-term profitability, may be a longer-term average of calendar year combined ratios. Over a 10-year period, from 2001 to 2010, the average combined ratio was 119. Moving 5 years forward, the 10-year average from 2006 to 2015 has decreased to 112.5. And moving another 5 years forward, even when including the very low combined ratios of the most recent several years, the 10-year average combined ratio is 100. The point is that a single calendar year combined ratio may be of interest to company shareholders and investors, but should not necessarily be relied upon to measure longer-term profitability. I hope you enjoyed the 2021 State of the System presentation. Once again, the Rating Board is committed to continue monitoring and reporting on the workers' compensation system. As things change very quickly, I am hopeful that the information I provided here will be useful for all industry stakeholders and will serve as the benchmark for future comparisons of various statistics between the pre- and post-pandemic workers' compensation environments. Thank you, and back to you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Ziv. I hope you found the 2021 State of the System presentation insightful. If you'd like to review the information that you just heard, you can view the print version of the 2021 State of the System report on our website, www.nycirb.org. We'll now take a 5-minute break so you can stretch your legs, grab a drink, and prepare for our next presentation. insights into the New York State economy. See you soon. Welcome back. As you know, New York's economy is experiencing tremendous change. And to say that this is a unique time is an understatement. So I'm happy to introduce Dr. Erica Groschen to help us walk through it all and provide us with a view of the state's economy. Dr. Groschen is a senior labor economics advisor at Cornell University. And from 2013 to 2017, Dr. Groschen served as the 14th Commissioner of the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, the principal federal agency responsible for measuring labor market activity, working conditions, and inflation. Dr. Groschen, you have the floor.
Thank you for the introduction, Jeremy. And thank you to the audience for being here today. My topic today is an economic update. What I want to do is go through two important things. What are economic conditions now? And looking forward, what should we be thinking about? So in economic conditions, I want to talk about the labor market and COVID in particular, GDP and inflation, and then take a minute to focus on New York in particular. And then having understood where we are, looking forward, what are the forecasts out there? What are the risks? And finally, what is it that we need to be able to make good decisions in this economic climate? Because as you all know, we're beset by a number of forces that are very unusual for us. And so this is really an uncertain time. So let's get going. Let's talk about US economic conditions. And this is really my favorite chart for understanding where we are generally in the economy. So this shows the job losses associated with the COVID pandemic relative to job losses for all the post-World War II recessions. The vertical axis is the difference in the number of jobs since the previous economic peak. So it's all negative because it's the beginning of the recession, you're at the peak, and then you have the job losses. And after that, you start to get the recovery. So on the horizontal axis is the months since the employment peak. And there's a different line for each recession. And the last two recessions are shown in non-shades of blue. So all the blue ones are recessions up until the 2001 recession. The green line is for the Great Recession, which, as we all know, lasted longer and was deeper than any previous post-World War II recession. And the red line is the current recession, the COVID-19 recession. And you can see that COVID recession stands out in two ways. First of all, for a very abrupt decline, much more abrupt than we saw in the previous recessions, and a very deep decline, much deeper than we saw in any of the previous recessions. After those 2 months of very dramatic declines where we lost 15% of the jobs in the economy, we saw a rapid recovery as the spread was contained. So we got this very rapid recovery for a few months, but then the winter surge, a resurgence of COVID, flattened the recovery for a while. And then the development of the vaccine helped to speed up the recovery again. So that's where we are now. And you can see that we are now, our job losses are about 4%, which is a dramatic improvement from having lost 15% of jobs. But we are still at a point where we're near the trough of everything but the Great Recession. So we are still in what in all of the other recessions would have been called the depths of the recession. So where have these job losses been and where has the recovery been? Let's take a look at that. This shows payroll jobs lost and gained, lost during the decline and then gained during the recovery. So the losses are in red and the gains from from April to July of 2021 are in blue. And first of all, and this breaks it up by major industry group. So the first thing to notice is the very high degree of correlation between the losses and the gains. So most of the job gains that we've had have been restoring jobs to the industries from which they were lost. In fact, the correlation between these two bars is something like 0.94, which is very close to 1, which would be a perfect correlation. The places where we see that we still have a lot of losses that have, and not as much gain is lost, are particularly leisure and hospitality and local government. Those stand out, although there are no industries where we have gained more jobs than were lost. So we're still behind a bit on all of them, which is what we expect since we're still down 4% of our jobs. So most of the recovery has been returning people to jobs similar to the ones, either exact jobs that they had before or similar ones. Let's now that's all of that context is about the numbers of jobs. Now let's talk about unemployment rates. So this is jobs are jobs, right? The unemployment rate talks about people and looks at what situation they're in. This chart is a bit complicated, but it shows you the unemployment rate 2020 and 21, and that's a percent of the labor force. The blue line is the familiar official unemployment rate from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And I've noted the unemployment rate at each one of these months during that whole time. The dotted lines horizontally show you the maximum unemployment rates during the Great Recession, that's at 10%, and the 25% maximum unemployment rate during the Great Depression. And so it gives you an idea of historically how high these unemployment rates have been. The red dotted line is the official unemployment rate plus the maximum impact of misclassifications. So let me take a minute to explain what that means. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has been very open about the fact that because the COVID shutdowns were so unusual, it was a challenge to correctly classify people when they answered the survey questions. Now, the unemployment rate comes from a household survey of over 60,000 households, and each adult, for each adult, the person who answers the survey answers questions about their labor market activity. And answering those questions was particularly difficult during the shutdown period. And in particular, there were a lot of people who were really on temporary layoff, but those words were never used. And so when they answered the questions, their answers had them put into a category called employed but not at work. And that's typically used for people who are taking a leave of some kind, a jury duty or a National Guard service or something like that. It's not for people who aren't at work because their place of work has been shut down or they've been sent home for safety reasons. So it's supposed to be for employee-initiated leaves from work, whether they're paid or unpaid. But the way people answer questions put them in it's probably the wrong category. Now, the BLS can't go back and change people's answers. It does not want to be in the business of changing people's answers. But it did note that probably particularly at the very depths of the recession in April of 2020, and very high, almost 5% of the labor force misanswered this question, likely. So this gives you an idea that the unemployment rates that we saw at the depths were higher than officially reported. And there's still a discrepancy of 0.3 of a percentage point even now in July. So we have a lot of these misclassifications. The reason I'm pushing this through is I want you to be clear about the fact that the amount of distress, the amount of disruption in the labor force is probably larger than one would pick up by looking only at the official statistics for unemployment, the unemployment rate in particular. And the reason, now when the unemployment rate comes out, the BLS provides thousands of numbers, but it's useful to have a headline number. And that tends to be what people focus on. However, that's never the whole story. So now let me show you some of the other things that you might want to consider when you look at the state of the labor market. I want to point out that unemployment rates differ substantially by race. So this shows the official unemployment rate for the US as a whole. That's the number we were looking at before. It's currently 5.4%, and then breaks it out by Black or African Americans, who still have an unemployment rate of 8.2%, Hispanic, Latinos 6.6%, Asians a little bit lower than the US total, and whites at 4.8%. So the non-white unemployment rate, particularly Blacks and Hispanics, rose much more than for white workers. And the Hispanic unemployment rate was particularly volatile during this recession. It reached much higher levels during the depth of the recession and has recovered more quickly than the Black and African American unemployment rate. And that has a lot to do with the different industries that they work in. So I've been talking about how the unemployment rate is in some ways just the tip of the iceberg for the disruptions that we've had in the labor market. And let me delve into that a little bit more deeply. So the headline measures just can't track everything. One number is not going to measure all dimensions. There are many ways that workers' jobs were disrupted. There are, of course, the layoffs, which are counted in the unemployment rate. But there are also these unofficial layoffs that I talked about, the misclassifications, people who are with a job, but they're not at work because of COVID. There are people who are on short hours because of COVID, and there are people who've left the labor force entirely, either permanently or temporarily, because of the pandemic. So those are there are many more disruptions than just layoffs. And within all of those disruptions, I think it's important to look at how many of the disruptions maintain an employer-employee connection, because those are the jobs that are going to be easiest to be restored versus the cases where workers are completely separated from their employer, and to return to employment, they're going to have to get a new job. So let me show you what my measure of the total disruptions of the labor market have looked like during this recession. This shows you all the different components that I talked about. So you can see, first of all, the headline unemployment rate that we talked about before includes only the, look at this a little more carefully, okay, includes only the unemployed workers on temporary layoff and the unemployed workers not on temporary layoff. So that is the light blue section that, that you see got very, very large in April. And then the golden section, which are the people who lost their jobs, who are unemployed and have no connection to their employer. So those two are the unemployment rate. The things above and below it, the purple parts, are people who left the labor force, the top two purple parts. And then the darker blue aqua parts are people who have short hours or are at work, or rather are employed but not at work. You can see, first of all, that the headline unemployment rate understates the disruptions by about half. And then the other way to look at this is that all of the bottom three sections are cases where workers have an attachment to their employer. So early on in April, 75% of the disruptions were for people who still had an attachment to their employer. They weren't at work or they were working shorter hours, but they were still tied to their employer. By now, when you get all the way out to July 2021, less than half of these disruptions are people who have ties to their employers. So we have more and more people who've been cut loose entirely, which means it's likely to be harder to recover from as rapidly as we were going before. So this next slide shows you the employer, talks about employer-employee job connections and recovery. So these very high connections probably were an important part of why we could recover so rapidly during the first part of our economic recovery. Lower job search and recruitment time and effort. Just the employer called up the worker and said, come back to work. The workers were already trained, they were onboarded, they were immediately productive, and they certainly weren't anxious and cutting their as anxious as they would have been if they were without a job entirely, right? But the remaining jobs with connections, first of all, they can't guarantee a rapid recovery of the sort that we were seeing before because there were fewer of them. Employers may fail or change their operations, ties can weaken, or they can hold back needed changes. And also, workers, of course, may have died, become disabled, or left the labor force entirely. So it's pretty unlikely that we can maintain the very rapid pace that we saw early on. What we're going to need are more investments, more new businesses, more retraining as the pandemic allows. So let's turn to another measure now of the state of the economy. And this is GDP, gross domestic product. So this is the measure of how much our domestic economy produces. And this is produced by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. This divides it up by quarters. And you can see that we had a very big loss in the first quarter of 2020, which was, that's actually quite large, a decline of 5%, or a rate of decline of 5%. But the really huge loss was in the second quarter, right? Where you had about a GDP rate of shrinkage of about 30% at an annualized rate. The next quarter, we had a big rebound of GDP growth. And since then, we've had solid growth in GDP by historical standards, but not quite, it turns out, as high as most forecasts have had it. At the same time, we've had some unusual inflation patterns too. This shows you the main headline index of inflation, the consumer price index. And you can see that it tends to be somewhat volatile. We had inflation decline pretty dramatically during the shutdowns. In fact, it basically got to zero. All right. And then it picked up a little bit. And then we've had this spike in basically mostly in 2021. So right now, it's pretty high by historical standards. The last time we had it this high was at the beginning of the 2007 recession. And you may not be able to see it clearly, but the last month, the level of inflation was flat but at a high rate. So there are a lot of discussions now about whether it's going to stay high, get higher, or come down. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Let me turn now to just talk a little bit about how New York has been doing. And I'm going to focus on New York's, on the unemployment rate and what's happening to payroll jobs. So first, the unemployment rate. New York's unemployment rate in July is still one of the highest in the country. Only Nevada and Puerto Rico have higher unemployment rates, and theirs are only, Nevada's is 7.7%, very close. California's is the same as New York's. Puerto Rico's is notably higher. It's I think 8.3%. So New York has one of the highest unemployment rates in the country at the moment. So it has been hit very hard by the recession, and the recovery is a bit slower here than elsewhere. Dividing upstate from downstate, the recovery in upstate New York has been more complete. The recession was a little bit less deep in upstate New York, and the recovery has been faster. In downstate New York, I want to point out that that the official numbers, which are in the dark color, all right, suggest that the recovery in downstate New York has actually been a little bit stronger than a corrected number would show. So probably there's more weakness in downstate New York than the official numbers are showing yet. The New York Fed does an early estimate of the benchmark change adjustment that will be made to these numbers. So when BLS puts these numbers out, it then goes back and checks them against more comprehensive data, and sometimes it makes some adjustments, and it looks like downstate will be adjusted downward. So downstate is struggling a little bit more than the numbers, the early numbers will suggest. Okay, so looking forward, where do we think we're going to go? Okay, the typical recessionary spiral has a shock, which causes a decline, a contraction. Then you get to the trough of the recession, and then you have after the trough, you have the expansion that gets you back to the peak. And that's what a recession looks like. And usually what happens in a recession is uncertainty because of the shock, the jobs and the revenue losses causes precautionary restraint, and that feeds on itself. You get a self-reinforcing downward spiral. The restraint causes more uncertainty, and households and firms and state and local governments cut their consumption and investment. Banks raise lending standards, and this gives you a downward spiral that is not good for the economy, and that's typical of a recession. You can think of it as a strong headwind too. And what breaks that and gets you back to the expansionary mode is very often resumption of consumption that's supported by relief. So policy measures to make sure people don't have to cut their consumption too much. And also investment decisions by the public sector and the private sector that kind of primes the pump and restores confidence again. So our questions are really what's going to happen this time. And do we think this is going to happen this time? Yes, it will happen. But how quickly it will happen depends really on the path of COVID, whether we have more natural disasters that slow us down, and how strongly policy supports return to expansion by providing relief and investment. Now, we've been very active on the relief side during the recession, and I think that's been extremely helpful. And the question is, will we then also get the other support we need in terms of public investment that will help to get us back to an expansionary path? Because we have 4 sources of job growth during the recovery. We have the old jobs regained. Those are kind of the cyclical components. Some of them are associated with the pandemic and some are associated with the recessionary spiral and recovery. That's more confidence driven, right? That's what I've been talking about. So we have these old jobs regained. And then we have 2 kinds of new jobs that are started up afterwards. And some of them, and these are structural changes. These are jobs in places, companies, industries, occupations where we didn't have them before. And some of those will be continuations of trends that were already in place, trends from automating, robots, things like that, globalization, climate change, changes in demographics. All of those things change the nature of jobs in the economy. And we'll have those continued trends. And then on top of that, this time we have adjustments that are going to be long run as an impact of the pandemic. So there are job changes as a result of more remote work and transactions. There are job changes associated with innovations in supply chain management and more local production. There will be changes associated with new assessments of what it means to provide safety in communal living situations. And then also infrastructure changes to schools, broadband, hospitals, public health, and official statistics that will be affected by the pandemic. So we're going to have all of these sources, and it is typical of a recession to have those sources. And those are the things to look out for. So what is the path that we're likely to see? Well, for 2021, we're almost done with that, but basically the shutdown effects seem to be moderating more or less. The question is the recession are we going to get a resurgence of this recessionary dynamic that I was talking about before, where you get a decline in confidence? So are we going to get that a long period of jobless recovery that we saw during the last 2 recessions, or are we going to continue with a fairly fast pace of recovery, right? So if what we've done so far is we had this steep decline, we had a rapid recovery, and then we're likely to see a slower pace for the rest of the improvement, and that gives us what people call the swoosh shape of the recovery. And if we do something like that, then it looks like it's going to take us 5 to 8 years to return not to the 2019 level of jobs, that'll be much faster, but to return to the trend we were on before. The fastest part of the recovery is likely over, and this is probably going to be followed by a fairly long slog. Policy can speed this recovery, but it really will depend on the virus. The risks, of course, are presented by the path of the pandemic and the supply chain and other adjustment issues. So we can go further into that. One thing people talk about is the inflation spike. That is likely temporary. The supply chain effects are likely to dissipate over time, and they cause volatility, but they're likely to dissipate. Some of the increase in prices are actually recovering from the steep declines in prices we saw early on in the recession. So those will go away. But inflation is likely to be in the range from 2 to 3% over the next year or 2. And that's intentional on the part of the Federal Reserve because they want an average rate of inflation of about 2%, which means that some of the time it needs to be above 2%. So that I'm pretty confident that that's what we're going to see on the inflation side. But we do have other risks. We can make a list of all the risks. Probably the biggest risk is the pandemic continues or worsens at home or abroad. The supply chain problems could persist, poke up in different places. Inflation could worsen. The recessionary dynamic with loss of confidence could strengthen. And policy could stop responding, either doesn't respond or tries and fails, right? On the upside, of course, the pandemic could be faster than expected. Maybe and there will be no more new variants. Maybe people will start to be vaccinated in higher rates. And we could get a more rapid rebound of confidence. Policy could be extremely helpful. So all of those things are possible. So now I want to turn to this big question: to manage risks. How do we manage risks in this highly uncertain environment? And there's actually a very simple answer. We all need official statistics, because official statistics are data that we can all understand and trust. Without them, we are really flying blind. We are the blind leading the blind. But we know that official statistics are not perfect. And as a matter of fact, during the COVID era, we saw some of the deficiencies in our official statistics. They make official statistics, the challenges of those statistics are particularly apparent during this time. So to better inform the decisions that businesses and families and governments make, we need more granularity of statistics, so more geographic detail. They need to be more timely and frequent. All of these things will help us to make better, faster decisions. We need more consistency across products so that we can link them and combine them. And we need more agility to ask new questions, because we don't always know the new questions that we're going to be needed, that we need to answer when a new crisis hit. We also need guaranteed independence from political influence so we can really trust the answers. And of course, privacy protection in a world where that's more and more difficult. So how do we get there? And the answer is actually that we need the help of everybody who's on this call today. Every one of you can help to improve official statistics, and I hope that you will. First of all, whenever you see or hear about any political interference with statistics, it's very important to decry that interference, because the independence of the statistical agencies from political interference is really necessary for trust and for the data to be valid. So you can help do that by speaking up for evidence and for official statistics. Don't be a free rider. And what that means, from your perch in your business, in your professional community, and even at your home, you need to do things like attesting for the trustworthiness of the statistics, because there are too many people casting aspersions on them who don't know what they're talking about. If you use the statistics, if you trust them, then you need to be willing to stand up and say why you trust them and why it's important to have them. And if you need any more information, the websites of the statistical agencies will provide you with any information you need, and you can just call them up and ask them your questions. You need to cite your sources. The statistics didn't come from nowhere. They came from our hardworking public servants who are out there all the time producing them. And you need to give them credit so that people understand where they come from. You at home and the companies that you work for, the organizations you work with, should participate in federal surveys. Almost all of this participation is voluntary. And if you want to use the data and you want it to be good, you need to be sure that your company is participating and that you are encouraging others to participate in those surveys. They are safe. The statistical agencies have not had major breaches, and that's because they work very hard to make sure that's true. You also need to support funding and the restructuring of the statistical agencies so they can make the changes that we've been talking about. The statistical agencies have been badly underfunded, particularly in the past 2 decades. BLS in particular has had flat funding during that time, and that's made it very difficult for them to innovate in the way that they would like to be able to. So what can you do? You can join the Friends of BLS. You can go to the Friends of BLS website. You can join the LinkedIn Friends of BLS group. You can follow Friends of BLS on Twitter. So I encourage you to use your trusted voice to try to do your part to make sure that the statistics are as good as you need them to be. So let me conclude by summarizing everything that I've talked about. We had a very abrupt shock by historical standards, and we're over 2/3 of the way back. Yet the headline statistics understate the impact on workers by about half even now. African American and Hispanic workers' jobs are more disrupted than white workers' jobs. The jobs recovery pace ahead is uncertain because the share of disrupted workers tied to employers was high, but now it's much lower. So the prospects for future recovery will depend on the pandemic and the recessionary dynamic, how quickly confidence is restored, right? How effective our fiscal relief is, how strong our infrastructure stimulus will be, and also the quality of the official statistics that we all use to guide our decisions going forward. I really appreciate the opportunity that I've had to talk to you today. If you want to know more about these topics, you can go to the BLS website. You can sign up for their e-alerts or their Twitter accounts. I write blogs that are posted on the ILR Work and Coronavirus Hub, and the link is provided here. There's a paper that I wrote that looks at many of these numbers through September 20th. Through September 2020, talks about them in far more detail. And I've kept all of those charts updated, and those have been appearing on the Work and Coronavirus Hub and also my personal webpage, which I'm about to launch sometime within the next couple of weeks. So I thank you very much. Thank you to the hosts for inviting me and to you for paying attention. And I'm sure that you have many questions. Please feel free to send me an email at ericagroshen@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to tell you what I think. Thanks again, and have a good day. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Dr. Groshen. Dr. Groshen's presentation will be available for viewing on our website. Next up is the Rating Board's Director of Actuarial Products and Special Projects, Ben Witkowski. Ben will present the 2021 Pandemic Impact Study. You're up, Ben.
Thanks, Jeremy. Good afternoon. The purpose of this presentation is to provide insight into COVID-19 claims and the pandemic's impact on the New York workers' compensation system. To do so, we are going to cover the unique characteristics of COVID-19 claims, identify several differences between these claims and non-COVID claims, as well as provide information on the pandemic's impact on non-COVID claims. While the pandemic is well into its second year, the data currently available is still considered preliminary. It will be some time before the pandemic's full impact on the New York workers' compensation system is known. So we will continue to investigate these issues and publish updated information as we gain a better understanding of the pandemic. First, let's compare the number of COVID-19 claims filed with the Workers' Compensation Board to the total number of infections in the state. The data in this slide is valued as of May 30th, 2021. This first line represents the cumulative number of positive infections in the state of New York. you can see that the first surge occurred at the beginning of the pandemic, followed by the relatively low increase of new infection rates in the summer and fall of 2020, and then there was the dramatic 2020 holiday surge that started around Thanksgiving and didn't conclude until February 2021. Since that time, there has been another surge in the United States, but for now, it has been less dramatic in New York due to the relatively high vaccination rates compared to the rest of the US. The blue line is what we would consider the positive cases among employed workers. According to the CDC, about 75% of the positive COVID cases have been in the 18 to 64-year-old range. And of the working age population, just under 70% were employed in 2020. So we applied that to the number of positive cases to show the magnitude of the positive cases among employed New Yorkers. Now, the gray line at the bottom is the number of workers' compensation claims filed with the Workers' Compensation Board. You can see that as of the end of May 2021, there were about 24,000 claims reported, which is about 2.2% of the positive cases for employed New Yorkers. There are several possible explanations for the relatively low claim filing rate. For example, it is reasonable to assume that many workers who contract COVID-19 in the course of employment will experience mild symptoms and have a minimal amount of lost time. Those may choose to take advantage of paid leave programs offered pursuant to federal law, state law, local ordinance, or company policies instead of applying for workers' compensation benefits. According to the CDC, the majority of individuals who contract COVID-19 experience relatively mild symptoms, with about 30% of individuals being asymptomatic. Similarly, it is also reasonable to assume that the workers who suffer more severely from the COVID-19 disease are more likely to file for workers' compensation benefits than those with mild symptoms who may only be eligible for minimal temporary benefits. This includes those with lengthy hospitalizations, significant medical interventions, or permanent injuries. According to the CDC, less than 4% of the individuals who test positive for COVID-19 require hospitalization. This next chart is the same data as the previous slide, but instead of cumulative, it is shown on an incremental basis. You can clearly see the peaks of the weekly infections in orange in April of 2020 and January of 2021. The blue line represents the COVID-19 workers' compensation claims, which spike after each infection peak. The lag between the spring 2020 infection peak and the COVID claims that followed was about 3 weeks and was reduced to 2 weeks during the holiday surge. What is also of interest is the relative size of the peaks. During the first wave, stay-at-home orders were in place, keeping many workers at home while essential workers continued to report to the workplace. And at the beginning of the pandemic, the available testing was limited and reserved for those who were most sick. In contrast, during the second wave in December of 2020 and January of 2021, readily available testing made way for the recording of more positive cases. This difference in testing availability and the resulting difference in positive cases during the first and second wave is likely one of the many reasons that there were more workers' compensation claims relative to infections during the first wave. Now, let's talk about the distribution of claims by county. The geographic distribution of non-COVID claims is similar to the geographic distribution of the state's population. However, the distribution of COVID-19 claims is disproportionately skewed towards the downstate counties. For example, New York City represents 32% of non-COVID claims, but 49% of COVID-19 claims. This is partly driven by the population density. The New York City and Long Island regions contain the counties with the highest population densities in the state. In addition to population density, the higher relative infection rate in downstate counties may also have been driven by their proximity to major international airports, which likely served as an entry point of the virus into the state. Next, let's take a look at the claim distribution by gender. In this graph, the COVID-19 claim distribution is on the left and the non-COVID is on the right. Orange is the percentage of cohorts that are female, and blue is male. Typically in the workers' compensation system, almost 60% of non-COVID claimants are male because there's a higher proportion of male workers in industries with higher incidence of workplace injuries. However, of the COVID-19 claimants, 53% of them were female. This difference is primarily attributed to the gender distribution in the industries that were disproportionately affected by the pandemic. Throughout the pandemic, the vast majority of COVID-19 claims came from the healthcare and social assistance industry, where more than 75% of the workers are female. The healthcare and social assistance sector experienced the most COVID-19 claims, which was driven by the increased exposure to the virus, along with a higher likelihood of compensability. While workers in any industry could have been exposed to the virus at the workplace, the healthcare and social assistance sector experienced the most COVID-19 claims. This is not surprising. First, in this economic sector, doctors and nurses were working directly with COVID-19 patients and were exposed to infection. Second, in June of 2020, the New York State Workers' Compensation Board issued a bulletin suggesting that claims made by medical care workers, along with other frontline essential workers, are more likely to be deemed compensable. In a typical year, the construction and manufacturing industries make up about 13% of claims. But out of the COVID-19 claims from 2020, they make up less than 2%. Next, we looked at the distribution by part of body. Almost 60% of COVID-19 claims reported lungs as the injured part of body, which is consistent with the respiratory nature of the virus. An additional 25% of COVID-19 claims reported multiple body systems as the injured part of body, where lungs are among the body parts injured as well as other organs affected by the virus. By contrast, non-COVID claims are predominantly musculoskeletal, with the most common body parts being back, shoulders, and knees. It was initially hypothesized that older workers would be more significantly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic than younger workers. In this exhibit, the orange line is the COVID-19 claim distribution by age, compared with the blue line, which is the non-COVID claim distribution. The nearly overlapping distributions demonstrate that age did not meaningfully impact the distribution of COVID-19 claims compared to non-COVID claims. The only real difference that we can see is that workers under 30 filed less than 18% of COVID-19 claims, while they filed slightly higher than 22% of non-COVID claims. Early indications show that just like the non-COVID claims, COVID-19 claims get more expensive as the injured worker gets older. In the workers' compensation system, injuries resulting in lost time from work always have a medical cost component. Also, as a quick reminder, in New York, in order to be eligible for indemnity benefits, a claimant must be out of work for more than 7 days. Here we show the distribution of claims by loss type, with medical-only claims in blue, indemnity-only claims in gray, and claims with both indemnity and medical in orange. More than 30% of the COVID-19 claims were reported as indemnity only, without an associated medical cost component, which is significantly higher than for non-COVID claims. It's possible that the lack of small medical costs on some COVID-19 claims is due to the federal government or employee health insurance paying those costs, like COVID-19 diagnostic testing. It's also possible that some of these indemnity-only claims were filed for lost time incurred during a mandatory quarantine. While most COVID-19 infections were asymptomatic or resulted in very mild symptoms, as noted above, individuals who tested positive for COVID-19 or were exposed to somebody with COVID-19 may nevertheless be subject to a mandatory quarantine exceeding the 7-day waiting period, thereby triggering an indemnity-only workers' compensation claim without medical costs. Similarly, medical-only claims, which typically involve relatively minor injuries that do not result in lost time from work exceeding the 7-day waiting period, represent about 60% of non-COVID claims, but only 14% of COVID-19 claims. About 55% of the COVID-19 claims that required medical care beyond testing were often more significant and also resulted in time off from work exceeding the 7-day waiting period. Let's look at some recent metrics related to the average cost of lost time claims in accident year 2020. On the slide, the average cost of COVID-19 claims are in blue, and non-COVID claims are in orange. Most importantly, the average cost of a COVID-19 lost time claim is significantly lower than the average cost of a non-COVID claim. Specifically, the paid medical severity of lost time COVID-19 claims is significantly lower than that of non-COVID lost time claims, and this difference is driven by fewer surgeries and physical medicine services provided. So we showed that COVID-19 claims have a much lower average cost than non-COVID claims. We also analyzed the closure rate on lost time claims. As in the previous exhibit, COVID-19 claims are in blue and non-COVID claims are in orange. While the lost development on COVID-19 claims remains unknown, it is very likely that COVID-19 claims will develop less than non-COVID claims. This assumption is supported by the difference in closure rates as of 12/31/2020. The higher closure rate of COVID-19 claims means that these claims will develop less than non-COVID claims because lost development is more significant on open claims. This implies that the differences in the average severities between COVID-19 and non-COVID claims that we showed in the previous slide may become even more significant as claims develop over time. Continuing with the drivers of indemnity severity, we proceed to examine the prevalence of death benefits within the cohort of COVID-19 claims compared to the non-COVID-19 claims. Here, we show the percentage of claims, transactions, and payments that death benefits represented for COVID-19 claims in blue and non-COVID claims in orange. Focusing on the percentage of payments at the bottom, we can see that death benefits account for approximately 9% of indemnity payments on COVID-19 claims compared to just 0.6% of indemnity payments on non-COVID claims, a significant difference. Typically, 100 to 150 death claims are filed in New York each year, and almost all of them are the result of a traumatic injury. Data submitted to date indicates that there were fewer non-COVID death claims in 2020 than there would have been in a typical year. However, due to the additional workplace fatalities caused by COVID-19, the share of death benefits out of total payments was higher in 2020 than it would have been in a typical year. While there is a stark difference in death benefits paid when comparing COVID-19 claims and non-COVID claims, temporary disability benefits are a much larger driver of the workers' compensation costs. First, let's examine the temporary disability benefits to see if there's a meaningful difference between COVID-19 and non-COVID claims. Temporary benefits can be categorized as either temporary total or temporary partial. Injured workers who are able to perform some of their previous job duties may be awarded temporary partial benefits, whereas workers who are unable to perform any of their pre-injury duties may be awarded temporary total benefits. In this graph, we show the COVID-19 temporary payments on the left and the non-COVID temporary payments on the right. The temporary total payments in blue represent the majority of payments for both COVID-19 and non-COVID claims, whereas temporary partial payments make up the minority of payments in orange. The distribution of temporary payments between COVID-19 claims and non-COVID claims is quite different. While temporary partial payments represent about 23% of all non-COVID temporary benefits, they represent less than 6% of COVID-19 temporary benefits. In other words, when temporary payments are issued in COVID-19 claims, they are almost all temporary total awards. Moving on to the drivers of medical severity, this graph shows the declining number of medical transactions and medical payments over the last 2.5 years. At the onset of the pandemic, in the second quarter of 2020, medical payments decreased by almost 30% compared to the first quarter of 2020. While the magnitude of this quarterly decrease is exceptional, it's consistent with the reduction in the number of claims. As you may recall from Zeev's State of the System presentation, claim counts were down significantly in the second quarter of 2020 compared to the second quarter of 2019. However, as the economy reopened in the third quarter of 2020, there was a slight rebound in medical payments as injured workers sought medical treatment. An examination of the quarterly trend of medical payments shows that the medical payments in the third, fourth, and first quarter of 2021 reverted back towards the recent decreasing medical payments trend line that began in 2018. The payment patterns illustrated in this exhibit hold true across most medical service categories. The exception was for payments for prescription drugs, which remained relatively stable through the pandemic. Now we are going to look at the time until treatment of evaluation and management visits, surgeries, and physical medicine visits. Near the beginning of the pandemic, there were concerns that injured workers were not going to be able to see doctors or get the same medical care because of the pandemic. There were times in 2020 where elective surgeries were not scheduled because hospitals were either at capacity or it was understood that the hospitals could be at full capacity within the next 2 weeks. However, delays in medical services were somewhat mitigated in the summer of 2020 as restrictions were relaxed. Evaluation and management services showed the largest increase in the time to first treatment at more than 20%. However, in terms of days, it was 3 days, going from 11 days in 2019 to 14 days in 2020. The time to first surgery went from 38 days to 42 days, which is a 9% increase, and the time to first physical therapy went from 41 days to 43 days, which is a 3% increase. Overall, the conclusion is that claims generally had similar patterns during the pandemic, but with some delays. Next, we are going to look at telehealth visits over time. The orange line is the medical payments, and the blue line is the transactions. Prior to the pandemic, telehealth services were not widely utilized in the New York workers' compensation system. In April of 2020, the Workers' Comp Board adopted emergency amendments permitting telemedicine and telephonic visits in some circumstances for social distancing purposes. As a result, telehealth services increased to 2.5% of total medical spend and about 3.5% of total medical transactions. In the second half of 2020, many physician offices were able to return to relatively normal operations, providing injured workers with the option of in-person visits. Nevertheless, telehealth services remained relatively high compared to pre-pandemic levels in the second half of 2020 and into 2021, representing about 0.5% of medical spend in the system. Although telehealth is not expected to remain as prevalent as it was during the height of the pandemic, the utilization of telehealth services is expected to continue after the pandemic. Last, we are going to review mental health visits. Prior to the pandemic, payments for mental health services represented approximately 0.8% of the total medical payments. During the second quarter of 2020, mental health payments increased by 50% and represented 1.2% of total medical spend. This change includes mental health treatment for both COVID-19 and non-COVID claims. Academic research indicates that the pandemic placed additional pressure on doctors and on the healthcare system generally, resulting in greater risk of psychological distress for healthcare providers. However, based on rating board data, the increase is primarily coming from supermarkets and building service contractor employees. Medical payment data appears to confirm the relationship between the pandemic and mental health services provided. In the last 2 quarters of 2020, payments for mental health services decreased back to a level slightly higher than the pre-pandemic levels, with approximately 1% of medical spend. The decrease corresponds to the reduced number of COVID-19 hospitalizations over the same period. As I mentioned in my introduction, the data reported to date offers only a first look at the pandemic's impact on the state workers' compensation system. We will continue to monitor developments in the system and will publish additional research and analyses as more information becomes available. Thank you. Back to you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Ben. The full 2021 Pandemic Impact Study, which provides key takeaways, a full analysis, as well as data sources, is available for viewing and download on our website. We'll now take a 5-minute break, and when we return, we'll discuss the future of experience rating in New York. See you soon. Welcome back. As I mentioned earlier today, the Rating Board will implement a new experience rating program for ratings effective on and after October 1st, 2022. Brett King, the Rating Board's Director of Actuarial Research, is joined by two of his lead researchers, CJ Moheen and Taylor Bodwin-Jones, to walk us through the new experience rating program. Take it away, Brett.
Thank you, Jeremy. As many of you now know, the New York State Department of Financial Services has approved a new experience rating plan for New York. And that plan will be in effect starting on October 1st, 2022. I'm here today with two of my colleagues, CJ Moheen and Taylor Bodwin-Jones, to explain why the New York experience rating plan is changing and what the new plan will be. Before we jump in, let's review the purpose of the experience rating program and some general concepts. The purpose of experience rating is to individualize premium for employers so that their premium better reflects their claims experience. In doing so, the program incentivizes employers to design and maintain safe workplaces. As you might expect, some occupations present a greater risk of injury than others. So, the experience rating program considers each employer's occupational classes and payroll size and generates an individualized expected experience for each employer based on a statewide average of similarly situated employers. The program analyzes each employer's most recent 3 years of experience, which we refer to as the experience period, and determines whether the employer had better than or worse than expected loss experience. Employers whose claims experience is better than expected are rewarded with a premium credit, or an experience mod under 1. Employers whose claims experience is worse than expected receive a premium debit, or an experience mod more than 1. By adjusting premium for each employer to reflect their loss experience, the program generates equity among employers. The program also incentivizes the maintenance of a safe working environment and implementation of safety practices to reduce the risk of injury in the workplace. Over the past several years, we conducted a full evaluation of our experience rating plan, which has been in place for several decades and which I'll refer to as our prior plan. Our study indicated that our prior plan required significant adjustments. We identified several areas where much improvement can be made. The new experience rating plan that we will discuss today incorporates the needed improvements and achieves the goals I mentioned a moment ago. Let's briefly discuss a few shortcomings of the prior plan. We discovered that the transition from the merit rating plan, which is generally used for employers with less than $5,000 of premium, to the experience rating plan, which is used for employers with more than $5,000 in premium, was not smooth. To explain, let's take a look at this slide. As you can see, most employers in the state are smaller in size. In fact, over 75% of employers in the state have less than $5,000 of premium and are not eligible for experience rating under the prior plan. These small employers are merit rated. However, employers with premiums just below and just above the $5,000 eligibility threshold often flip-flop between the experience rating and merit rating plans. While both plans have the same goal, the mods they produce are sufficiently different to create significant pricing instability and inequity for the many employers that are flip-flopping back and forth between the two plans year to year. For example, an employer that is merit rated could have more than 3 claims and their mod would be capped at 1.08. Meanwhile, a small experience rated employer with premium just over the $5,000 threshold might have only 1 claim and have received a mod above 1.3. This dynamic is inequitable and also brings a significant volatility in pricing to employers flipping back and forth between the two programs year to year. So, one of our challenges was to develop a plan that works well for both small and large employers. Now, another issue we discovered was that the credits and debits provided under the prior plan were not always sufficient. In the aggregate, we want experience mods to be predictive of future loss experience. We measure predictability through a quintile test. In a quintile test, we rank all employers in the state by the value of their mod, from the lowest to the highest, and divide them into 5 equal groups, with 20% of the state's employers in each group. So, the 20% of the employers with the lowest mods are grouped together and represented by the bar farthest to the left. And the bars from left to right represent quintiles increasing in mod factors, with the bar all the way to the right containing the 20% of the employers with the highest mod factors. The height of each bar represents that quintile's loss ratio. And when I use the term loss ratio here, I mean the ratio of actual losses to expected losses before applying the experience mod. When we look at the resulting loss ratios from these quintiles in graphical form before the experience rating mod is applied, we see clear differences in the level of losses that emerge relative to those that are expected from the class level loss costs. Because these differences exist and are predictive, we know there is a need for experience rating to adjust the expected losses to an amount reflecting differences among individual employers. We then compare the actual losses to the expected losses after applying the mod factor in the future period. Let's first talk about the ideal result. Ideally, employers with low mods receive a credit lowering their expected loss amount. As their expected loss amounts decrease, their loss ratios, the ratios of actual losses to expected losses, increase. Similarly, employers with high mods, the bars farthest to the right, will be charged a debit, increasing their expected loss, and as a result, their loss ratios would decrease. Notice how under an ideal experience rating plan, the mods are used to equalize the loss ratios across all quintiles. In other words, the ideal program makes the actual losses equal the expected losses across all the quintiles. We discovered that the prior experience rating plan is not performing as it should. The quintile test yields the graph on the right. The employers with low mods, the bar farthest to the left, are getting credits, but those credits are insufficient, which means that the expected losses for those employers are still too high. Put another way, while the loss ratio after application of the credit does increase because the expected loss amounts were reduced, the loss ratio does not increase enough because the credit was too small. Similarly, the employers with high mods, the bars farthest to the right, are getting debit mods, resulting in higher expected losses. But the debits are not sufficient to balance to actual losses, which are higher still. So, while our prior plan moves the results in the right direction, it does not move the results enough to achieve the ideal result. Our challenge was to make the plan more equitable. Employers with low mods should receive larger credits, resulting in lower premium, whereas the employers with the highest mods should receive larger debits, resulting in higher premium. I'm happy to tell you that our research and testing demonstrates that the new plan achieves this goal. Let's walk through the details of the new experience rating plan together. CJ and Taylor will help me describe some of the new plan features as well as explain the rationale that led us to our final plan structure. CJ, we held meetings with various stakeholders, business, labor, insurance companies, brokerages. What was their feedback they gave us on experience rating?
The stakeholders had a lot to say, and it gave us a lot to consider. In many instances, the stakeholders were in agreement on feedback. And in other instances, the preferences of some were different from those of others. But some general themes did emerge. All stakeholders want the plan to be simple, easy to understand, and easy to explain. In terms of the predictive power of the future experience, all stakeholders want the plan to be as accurate as possible. Some stakeholders express that stability in premium year to year is important for employers, especially small employers who may have difficulty adjusting to pricing volatility. And finally, all stakeholders agree that the plan should fulfill its basic goal of providing a strong safety incentive.
Thank you, CJ. So, our challenge was to achieve an appropriate balance between accuracy, stability, equity, and simplicity while incentivizing safety. We had our work cut out for us, but the new plan gets us to where we need to be. It will bring additional premium equity and incentivize workplace safety while also addressing other stakeholder concerns. One tool that we introduced in the new plan to help us achieve our goals is a variable split point, whereas in the prior plan we used a fixed split point. Taylor, please explain what a variable split point is and how it's used in our mod calculation.
Sure, Brett. Many of you may be familiar with the variable split point concept, as it has been in use in California for several years. First, let's talk about what a split point is, then I'll explain the difference between a fixed split point and a variable split point. A split point is a dollar value that divides losses into two portions. The losses below the split point are referred to as primary losses, and the losses above the split point are referred to as excess losses. As you mentioned, Brett, in the prior plan, this split point was one fixed number that applied to all employers. The new plan incorporates a variable split point that varies according to an employer's expected losses, which are a function of an employer's payroll and class code mix. A variable split point provides smaller employers with a lower split point than larger employers. In this way, variable split points allow for a more appropriate treatment of losses for employers of different sizes in the experience mod formula. Ultimately, this leads to more accurate and predictive mods. Think of it this way. Consider a very large employer with thousands of employees and lots of claims data. The more claims data there is, the more credible it is, the more predictive it is, and the more weight we can give to it. So for larger employers with a significant amount of claims data, we can apply a higher split point to permit more actual losses to flow through the formula and still achieve a credible result. On the other hand, for a very small employer, a claim may be a random or occasional event that isn't particularly predictive of future claims. Accordingly, smaller employers without many claims would be assigned a lower split point, which limits the amount of actual losses that flow through the formula. To summarize, as the size and credibility of an employer's claims data increases, the variable split point increases as well, permitting a larger amount of actual losses to flow into the formula and influence the mod calculation.
Thanks, Taylor. So, to summarize, the variable split point effectively acts as a loss cap that limits the actual primary losses at different amounts within the mod formula for each employer based on their actual size, and acts to optimize outcomes for all sizes of employers by appropriately splitting the employer's losses between the primary and excess components. It's also important to note that the lower split points assigned to smaller employers add stability to their mods, something that the stakeholders requested. Another benefit of using a variable split point is that it allows us to simplify the experience rating mod formula from its prior form to just 3 elements. Actual primary losses plus expected excess losses divided by expected losses. Recall the split point divides the losses into the primary and excess components. These components impact both the actual loss and the expected loss elements of the mod calculation. On the actual loss side, the split point serves as a cap that defines the actual primary losses, those losses that are under the split point. In the new experience mod formula, actual primary losses are given full weight, but the actual excess losses are not given any weight. On the expected loss side, we also use the split point to divide the losses into primary and excess components, with the expected excess losses receiving full weight in the new formula. The change from the fixed split point to the variable split point wasn't the only big change though. We also modified the state accident limit and how we use it. In the prior plan, the state accident limit was over $500,000. In the new plan, we use a state accident limit of $175,000. However, the state accident limit is not as visible as it used to be because actual losses will be limited by the split point, and the highest split point value is $170,000, $5,000 less than the state accident limit. CJ, can you please explain the implications of this change?
Sure, Brett. On the actual loss side, replacing the prior state accident limit with the variable split point acts to limit significant fluctuations in the mod, and it contributes to both stability and accuracy of the plan overall. Consider a small to medium-sized employer who experiences a $500,000 loss. A loss of this magnitude is quite rare and is not likely to happen again in the future. So we say that the $500,000 loss does not have a lot of predictive power. But under the prior formula, this kind of loss can have a significant impact on the mod. With the new formula, this loss will be capped by the variable split point, which is based on expected losses, a function of employer size and class mix. So at most, only $170,000 of losses from a $500,000 loss will flow into the mod calculation. And that is only for large employers assigned the largest split point. In this way, the variable split point limits the impact of a single claim and does so in a way that is appropriate for each employer. The new $175,000 state accident limit still plays an important role though, as it is used in the determination of some underlying plan parameters such as expected loss rates or ELRs that are used to calculate the expected losses.
Thanks, CJ. Let's shift to another aspect of the experience rating plan, mod capping. To enhance stability and credibility, we did a lot of work on the plan's capping procedures. Taylor, please share some of our insights from our mod capping.
The biggest change we made was to introduce a series of mod caps based on the number of claims in an employer's experience period. These claim caps mostly affect smaller employers with under $50,000 in expected loss. These smaller employers generally have very few claims, if any at all. As we mentioned earlier, we heard from several stakeholders that under the prior plan, one claim can have an outsized impact on the mod. The reason this happens is that the smallest policies are not expected to have a claim during the experience period. So when a small employer does have a claim, which is often just a random event, it could be over-leveraged in the resulting experience rating mod calculation. At the same time, our research also revealed that some small employers who are not expected to have any claims consistently experience multiple claims each year, and the parameters of the old plan did not produce a sufficient debit. In response to these two problems, we developed a novel capping method that caps mods based upon the number of claims incurred during the experience period. The mod caps are high enough to provide small employers that have numerous claims with higher, more appropriate mod values. And at the same time, they also protect small employers from the possibility that one or two claims will have an outsized impact on their mod. It's also important to note that the claim count-based mod caps were derived in a way to avoid impacting larger employers with numerous claims. Instead, the mods of large employers with numerous claims may be limited by a revised formula designed to cap the mod when there are 4 more claims. The new capping formula starts at a maximum mod of just over 2.0 for the smallest employers and linearly increases as the expected losses increase. Compared to the prior capping formula, large employers will be capped at lower, more appropriate mod values. For example, the cap under the prior plan for an employer with $1 million in expected losses is around 15, whereas under the new formula, the mod will be limited to 5.
Thanks, Taylor. To sum up, the new mod caps permit small employers to have higher mods when appropriate, while also protecting them from disproportionately high mods from just 1, 2, or 3 claims. And the revised formula cap limits mods for New York's large employers more equitably. These changes will also impact how the program is administered. The merit rating plan will be discontinued, and the new experience rating plan will be used for all employers in the state. Along with providing more appropriate mods for small employers, the elimination of the merit rating plan resolves the issues related to flipping back and forth between merit rating and experience rating that I identified earlier. The changes in structures also mean that when the new experience rating plan goes into effect on October 1st, 2022, New York will no longer participate in the interstate rating plan. New York policies will now have their own unique mod. This is similar to California, Pennsylvania, and other jurisdictions that are currently outside of the interstate rating plan. It's important to note that once New York exits the interstate rating plan, all ownership changes must be sent directly to the New York Rating Board via our Form ERM-14 or online managed ownership application. We will need this information to ensure that policies are properly linked together for the mod calculation. CJ, now that we've covered the components of the new plan, can you walk through the process of the new calculation?
Sure, Brett. As you mentioned earlier, to compute a mod under the new plan, 3 values are required: expected losses, expected access losses, and actual primary losses. The first thing that we need to determine is the expected loss in the experience period, and that value will go in the denominator of the formula. In both the prior plan and the new plan, expected losses are determined by multiplying the payroll in hundreds by expected loss rate, or ELR, for each class. We sum these expected losses over all policies and classes in the experience period and insert the resulting value in the denominator of the mod formula. The expected loss amount is also used to determine the split point value for the employer. Once we know the expected losses for the employer, we look up the corresponding split point from a table we will update every year. The variable split point table links expected loss ranges to split points. The smallest employer in the table has split points of $1,000, whereas the largest employer in the table have a split point of $170,000. Once we have identified the split point for the employer from the table, we look up the corresponding D ratio for each class of the employer. D ratios represent the percentage of expected losses estimated to be below the split point value for each class and the split point combination. The D ratios are used to calculate the expected primary and expected access loss amounts by class code. For example, a D ratio of 0.3 for a specific class code and a split point indicates that of the total expected losses, 30% are expected to be below the split point, and the remaining 70% are expected to be above the split point. So the D ratio is used to determine the expected primary losses, and the remaining expected losses are the expected access losses. In the experience mod formula, we used expected access losses directly in the numerator. We do not use the actual access losses. At the individual risk level, the losses above the split point can be quite volatile and not very predictive. So the expected access loss amount acts as a stabilizing component of the mod calculation because it reflects average expectations of losses above the split point. And as noted earlier, as the size of an employer increases, the variable split point enables more of the employer's actual experience to flow through the formula. The last component of the formula that we need is the actual primary loss. To determine the actual primary loss, we examine the actual loss experience of the employer and limit the actual loss amount from each claim at the employer's split point value. We then add all the actual limited losses together. In this way, we limit claims at a reasonable level based on the employer's size and class mix to ensure that the value flowing into the formula is credible. Now that we have the 3 values we need, we calculate the mod by summing the actual primary losses and expected access losses and dividing the result by the expected losses. Finally, Once we have calculated the mod value based on the formula, we check to see if it needs to be capped based on the capping rules we discussed earlier.
Thank you, CJ. Taylor, we also made a few changes to catastrophe claims and disease claims. Can you please describe those changes?
In the new plan, since we focus on the primary loss amounts, separate disease claim caps are no longer needed. We can treat all claims the same. Catastrophic accidents are those that involve 2 or more claimants. Under the prior plan, these occurrences were capped at 2 times the state accident limit. Under the new plan, only the 2 largest claims from catastrophic occurrences will be used in the calculation of the actual experience from each event.
Thanks, Taylor. CJ, what should employers expect in the first year with all these changes?
If we go back to the quintile test of the prior plan, we can see generally what will happen. Most employers should expect only a small change, since the middle 60% of employers were relatively close to the ideal result anyway. However, employers with the lowest mods, employers in the first quintile, will get more credit and pay less premium than they would under the prior plan, while the employers with the highest mod in the fifth quintile will generally receive more debit and may see a higher premium. So, some employers will see significant decreases in their mod, and some employers will see significant increases in their mod, but most employers won't notice too much of a change. However, since we anticipate a few employers will experience an increase in their mods, we will implement a transition plan for the first year to mitigate these increases in year 1 of the new plan.
Thanks, CJ. Taylor, what is the Rating Board's transition plan for these employers?
Because the new plan is quite different from the prior plan, we want to limit the upward mod changes that some employers will experience as a result of the new formula. As CJ mentioned, a few employers may experience significant mod increases, so we will cap certain increases to limit the impact of the new formula on employers in the first year of the program. To do this, we have added an additional cap that looks at what the prior mod formula would have produced with the new experience and adds 0.3 points to it to act as a transitional cap for each employer. However, we expect that the transitional cap will apply to less than 5% of employers.
Thanks, Taylor. It's important to note that the new plan is premium neutral, meaning that it will have no impact on the overall amount of premium collected in the state. We've gone through a lot of information today. Please know that we have also published a pamphlet which describes the new plan's components, explains how to compute an experience mod, and provides a sample experience rating worksheet. The pamphlet is available on our website. We have also posted an interactive sample experience rating worksheet on our website, which highlights the steps to derive the values needed for the computation of experience mods. We will also hold webinars this fall to further explain the new experience rating program and answer your questions. If you would like to participate in a webinar, please send your interest and contact information to experienceratingtransition@niserb.org. We also created a short cartoon to present to you today. It explains the new formula and provides mod computation examples. We hope you enjoy it, and please know that you can also find it on our website as well. Ronnie Rating Board, the floor is yours.
Hi, my name is Ronnie Rating Board. I'm here with you today to discuss the experience rating formula in New York. Then, we'll briefly describe its components and a few related concepts. We'll also demonstrate how to apply the formula as we go. This is the new experience rating formula. The mod equals the sum of actual primary losses and expected excess losses divided by expected losses. What does all this mean? Let's discuss it step by step. Let's start with expected losses. What are expected losses? The expected loss amount for an employer is its total anticipated loss amount during the experience period based on its occupational classifications and payroll. Expected losses are generally calculated by multiplying the expected loss rate, or ELR, for their occupational classifications by an employer's payroll divided by $100. Each occupational classification has its own ELR, reflecting the hazards of each class. Normally, larger employers engaged in more hazardous occupations will have larger expected loss amounts than smaller employers performing less dangerous work. Let's see how this concept works in practice by examining two different chocolate-making companies. First, Small Town Chocolate, with only $120,000 in payroll, and second, Standard Cocoa, a medium-sized company with $4 million in payroll. Since these two businesses have the same occupational classification for chocolate manufacturing, they also have the same ELR, $2.27 per $100 of payroll. To determine the expected losses for each company, we divide payroll by 100 and multiply it by the ELR. As you can see, because Small Town Chocolate has a smaller payroll than Standard Cocoa, it is also expected to have fewer losses. Let's plug each company's expected losses into the formula. Now that you have a basic understanding of expected losses, let's briefly discuss variable split points. A split point is a dollar value that separates losses into primary and excess components. The split point applied in this formula is variable in that it is determined by each risk's expected losses in the experience period. Expected losses are used to identify the appropriate split point for each company. As the amount of expected loss increases, so will the split point value. In our example today, Small Town Chocolate had $2,724 in expected losses, and this amount links to a split point of $1,500. As you just saw, Standard Cocoa's larger payroll results in $90,800 in expected losses, which links to a split point of $20,000. Each employer's split point is utilized in two processes. First, an employer's split point is used to separate its expected losses into expected primary losses and expected excess losses. To do that, we use an employer's split point to look up the D ratio for each occupational classification on the D ratio table, and multiply the D ratio by the expected losses to derive the expected primary and excess portion. As the split point increases, the share of losses in the primary portion will also increase. With a split point of $1,500, Small Town Chocolate has a D ratio of 0.063, meaning that 6.3% of losses are expected to be primary or below the $1,500 split point. In other words, with total expected losses of $2,724, Small Town Chocolate is expected to have $172 in expected primary losses and $2,552 in expected excess losses. Similarly, with a split point of $20,000, Standard Cocoa has a D ratio of 0.389, meaning that 38.9% of the losses are expected to be primary or below the $20,000 split point. With $90,800 in total expected losses, Standard Cocoa is expected to have $35,321 in expected primary losses and $55,479 in expected excess losses above the split point. Earlier, I mentioned that the variable split point is used for two purposes within the experience rating formula. We have described the first, determining expected excess losses. The variable split point is also used to derive the actual primary losses, losses that are most predictive of future experience. To derive actual primary losses, an employer split point is applied to separate each claim's actual loss amounts into primary and excess portions. By separating each claim's losses into primary and excess components, the variable split point utilizes an employer's expected losses to optimize the experience rating formula for each employer. Each employer's split point then acts to limit the impact of each actual claim's losses to ensure that larger claims do not overly influence the MOD. Let's assume that Small Town Chocolate and Standard Cocoa had the same loss experience. Each company had two claims, one for $12,000 and one for $35,000. Let's start with Standard Cocoa. The $35,000 claim will be limited by its $20,000 split point, whereas the $12,000 claim will not be limited by its split point. Both claims together give Standard Cocoa $32,000 in actual primary losses. In the case of Small Town Chocolate, both of the claims are larger than its $1,500 split point, so its split point will limit the impact of both claims, giving Small Town Chocolates $3,000 of actual primary losses, or $1,500 for each claim. Now that we have all of the inputs for the formula, let's derive the experience mod factors for each employer. These experience mods are not yet final. All experience mods are subject to a claim and formula capping methodology to protect employers from overly punitive mods. Since Small Town Chocolate only had 2 claims, its mod will be capped at 1.40. This claim count capping method is used to prevent smaller employers who experienced a few potentially random accidents from receiving too high a mod, while still allowing for appropriately higher mods where the loss experience warrants it. Small Town Chocolate's 1.40 mod appropriately reflects that this employer had more losses than were expected and incentivizes improvements in workplace safety. Standard Cocoa's mod of 0.96 is close to 1.0, suggesting that the actual experience is close to the expected experience for this employer. Standard Cocoa is not subject to either the claim or formula cap based on its calculated mod result. For more information, please visit the Rating Board's website.
Thank you, Brett, CJ, and Taylor. On behalf of the Rating Board, I want to express our gratitude to all of our presenters and those who joined us for today's virtually streamed Workers' Compensation Forum. I hope you enjoyed today's forum and use what you learned in a meaningful way, and that we all continue to work together to improve the system and make workplaces safer for New Yorkers. You'll soon receive a survey by email asking you to comment on your experience today and suggest topics for future research. Please complete the survey so that we can continue to improve the experience next year. Thank you and be safe.